Dr. Velthar Quinn stood before the massive crystal screen in the High Council chamber, his 6 eyes focused on the swirling images of a distant world. The planet looked ordinary enough, with blue oceans and white clouds spinning slowly around, a yellow star. But this world held something that had caught the attention of the most powerful beings in the galaxy. "The humans fight strangely," said Council Leader Thane, his voice echoing through the chamber like distant thunder. "Our allies, the Zephyrians, report unusual resistance patterns. These creatures should have surrendered weeks ago, yet they continue to fight with methods we do not understand." Quinn nodded, his scientific mind already working. As the Empire's leading expert on primitive species, he had studied dozens of worlds facing invasion. Most followed predictable patterns. First came panic, then desperate attacks, then negotiation, and finally surrender. It was the natural way of things. Species that could not adapt to superior force were meant to be conquered. "What makes these humans different?" Quinn asked, adjusting his recording device with one of his forearms. "See for yourself," Thane replied, touching a control panel. The screen filled with battle footage from the human colony world of New Haven. Quinn watched with growing confusion. The humans were clearly outmatched. Zephyrian ships filled the sky like metal clouds, their weapons turning buildings to dust with casual ease. The human defenders had primitive projectile weapons that barely scratched Zephyrian armor. Their vehicles looked like toys compared to the massive war machines rolling across their cities. Yet something was wrong with this picture. The humans were not running. They were not begging for mercy. Instead, they were fighting back with a fury that made no logical sense. "Observe this sequence," Thane said, highlighting a section of the recording. Quinn saw a group of human soldiers trapped in a burning building. Zephyrian forces had surrounded them completely. Any rational species would surrender at this point. Instead, the humans did something that made Quinn's skin change color with shock. They began singing. "What are they doing?" Quinn whispered. "We do not know," Thane admitted. "But watch what happens next." The singing humans suddenly burst from the building in all directions. Half of them died in the first few seconds, cut down by Zephyrian weapons. But their sacrifice allowed the others to reach new positions. Within minutes, they had destroyed 2 Zephyrian tanks and killed dozens of enemy soldiers. "This makes no sense," Quinn said, his scientific training struggling to process what he had seen. They achieved a tactical victory, but at what cost? Those deaths served no evolutionary purpose. "Exactly," Thane said. "This is why we need you on that world. Go to New Haven, study these humans, learn how they think. The High Council needs to understand this behavior before it spreads to other species." Quinn felt a mixture of excitement and unease. He had never studied a species during active combat. His usual work involved examining conquered worlds, cataloging the remains of civilizations that had already fallen. This would be different. This would be dangerous. "I will need special equipment," Quinn said. "Cloaking technology, advanced sensors, communication devices." "Already prepared," Thane replied. "You leave immediately. Remember, you are there to observe only. Do not interfere with the conflict. We need pure data, not contaminated by outside influence." 3 days later, Quinn found himself on the surface of New Haven, invisible to human eyes thanks to his advanced cloaking suit. The world was a mess of smoking ruins and burning vehicles. The smell of destruction filled the air, mixed with something else he could not identify. It would take him weeks to realize it was the scent of human determination. He had materialized near what his sensors identified as a major human defensive position. Through the smoke, he could see human soldiers moving with purpose between concrete barriers and metal walls. They looked smaller than he had expected, these humans, fragile. Their skin was soft, their movements slow compared to more advanced species he had studied. But there was something in the way they moved that caught his attention. No wasted motion. No panic. They communicated with quick hand signals and brief words, coordinating their actions like parts of a single organism. Quinn activated his recording equipment and moved closer to observe. A human wearing what appeared to be a leadership marking on his uniform was giving instructions to a group of younger humans. This had to be Captain Jake Morrison, according to the intelligence reports. "Listen up," Morrison was saying, his voice calm despite the sounds of battle in the distance. The Zephyrians are going to hit us again in about an hour. They think we're beaten. They think we're ready to give up. The younger humans looked at Morrison with expressions Quinn could not quite read. Fear was there, certainly. These humans were not immune to the basic survival instinct. But there was something else, something that seemed to push the fear aside. "Are we ready to give up?" Morrison asked. "No, sir," came the response, spoken by dozens of voices at once. "Then let's show them what humans do when we're cornered," Morrison said. Quinn watched as the humans scattered to their positions. He followed one group to a defensive wall where they began checking their weapons and ammunition. These tools were pathetically primitive by galactic standards. Chemical projectile weapons that worked by controlled explosions. Simple communication devices that barely functioned over short distances. Body armor that would not stop a child's toy from advanced worlds. Yet the humans handled these tools with the care and respect that Quinn's people reserved for their most sacred artifacts. They cleaned every surface, checked every connection, spoke to each other in quiet tones that somehow carried more weight than shouted orders. A young female human was adjusting her weapon when she noticed a small crack in another soldier's armor. Without being asked, she began repairing it with materials from her own kit. The soldier whose armor she was fixing did the same for someone else. In minutes, Quinn was watching a chain of mutual assistance that left every human in the group better, prepared for battle. This behavior puzzled him. In every other species he had studied, individuals focused on their own survival first. Cooperation happened only when it served personal interests. But these humans seemed to operate under different rules. They strengthened each other automatically, without calculation or expectation of reward. The attack came exactly when Morrison had predicted. Zephyrian forces appeared over the defensive wall like a dark wave, their weapons filling the air with deadly energy. Quinn expected the human position to fall within minutes. Instead, he witnessed something that would change everything he thought he knew about warfare and courage. The humans fought like nothing he had ever seen before. Not with the mindless fury of cornered animals, but with a controlled ferocity that seemed to channel their fear into precise action. They moved to protect each other as much as to attack the enemy. When one human fell, others immediately moved to fill the gap, maintaining their defensive line even as Zephyrian weapons cut through their ranks. And when Marine Lisa Carter saw a Zephyrian plasma grenade land in the middle of her squad, she did something that shattered Quinn's understanding of logical behavior. She threw herself on top of it. The explosion that followed should have demoralized the remaining humans. Instead, they fought harder. They shouted Carter's name as they fired their weapons. They used her sacrifice as fuel for their own courage. Quinn's hands shook as he recorded this scene, his scientific objectivity cracking like ice under sudden heat. These humans were not just fighting for survival, they were fighting for something else, something his advanced civilization had lost so long ago that they had forgotten it ever existed. As the battle raged around him, invisible and untouchable in his cloaking suit, Dr. Velthar Quinn began to realize that he was not just observing a military conflict, he was witnessing the birth of legends, and it terrified him more than anything he had ever experienced in his long, peaceful life. The underground tunnels beneath New Haven were nothing like the clean, efficient passages Quinn knew from advanced civilizations. These were rough concrete tubes filled with the smell of fear, sweat, and something else he was beginning to recognize as human determination. Emergency lights cast strange shadows on the walls as he followed the retreating defenders deeper into their makeshift fortress. Quinn had been observing the humans for 5 days now, and each day brought new confusion to his scientific mind. The battle above ground continued to rage, but down here in the tunnels, he was witnessing something that challenged everything he thought he knew about how species behaved under pressure. Paul Davis was the perfect example of this impossible behavior. The human engineer had been working without rest for 36 hours straight, converting farming equipment into weapons of war. Quinn watched through his cloaking field as Davis welded metal plates onto a simple tractor, turning it into an armored vehicle that could protect human soldiers from Zephyrian energy weapons. The human's hands shook from exhaustion. His eyes were red and swollen. Several times other humans approached him with offers to take over his work. Each time Davis refused with a shake of his head and returned to his welding. "Paul, you need to rest," said a female human wearing medical insignia. "You've been at this for over a day." "The Zephyrians don't rest," Davis replied, not looking up from his work. "Besides, I'm almost finished with this one. Just need to get the engine modifications working." Quinn studied the converted machine with his advanced sensors. Despite being built from primitive components, it showed remarkable engineering skill. Davis had somehow managed to create armor plating that would deflect Zephyrian energy weapons, at least for a short time. The work was crude but effective, exactly the kind of adaptation that allowed weaker species to survive against superior force. But what puzzled Quinn was why Davis continued working past the point of exhaustion. In any rational species, individual preservation would take priority over group survival. Yet this human seemed driven by something that overrode basic self-care instincts. The answer came when a young human soldier approached Davis with a photograph. "My sister's in the evacuation center," the soldier said. "This armor might be what keeps me alive long enough to see her again." Davis looked at the photograph for a long moment, then returned to his work with renewed energy. "Then we better make sure it's perfect," he said. Quinn recorded this exchange with growing bewilderment. The two humans had never met before the invasion. They shared no genetic relationship, no tribal bonds, no logical reason to risk personal survival for each other. Yet the engineer was literally working himself to death to protect a stranger, motivated by nothing more than the knowledge that his work might save another human's life. This pattern repeated throughout the tunnel complex. Everywhere Quinn looked, he saw humans making choices that defied evolutionary logic. Medical personnel treated wounded soldiers ahead of themselves, even when they were injured. Communication specialists maintained radio contact with surface units despite Zephyrian jamming that caused painful feedback through their equipment. Supply coordinators distributed food and ammunition to combat units while keeping almost nothing for themselves. But the most puzzling relationship Quinn observed was between Captain Morrison and his second-in-command, Lieutenant Amy Chen. The HFY. Two humans seemed to share a connection that transcended normal communication methods. They coordinated complex tactical decisions with minimal spoken words, anticipated each other's needs without being asked, and displayed a level of trust that seemed to bypass individual survival instincts entirely. Quinn watched them plan the defense of Tunnel Section 7, a critical choke point that controlled access to the civilian evacuation areas. The tactical situation was hopeless. Zephyrian forces were massing for a major assault that would overwhelm the human defenders within hours. Any rational commander would order a retreat to preserve as many lives as possible. Instead, Morrison and Chen were planning something that made Quinn's skin change color with shock. They were going to hold the position regardless of cost, and they both knew it was a suicide mission. "The charges are set," Chen reported, indicating explosive devices the humans had placed throughout the tunnel. "When the Zephyrians break through, we detonate everything. It'll bring down half the tunnel system, but it'll stop them from reaching the civilians." "How long do you need to get your people out?" Morrison asked. Chen looked at her captain with an expression Quinn could not fully decode. "I'm not leaving, Jake. You know that." Morrison was quiet for a long moment. Quinn could see conflict in the human's face, some internal struggle between different motivations. Finally, Morrison nodded. "I know, I wouldn't either." The conversation that followed made Quinn question everything he thought he understood about intelligent behavior. These two humans were calmly planning their own deaths, not out of despair or madness, but as a calculated tactical decision. They would die to buy time for civilians they had never met to escape to safety. What made it even more incomprehensible was the obvious emotional cost of this decision. Quinn could see that Morrison cared deeply about Chen's survival, and she felt the same about his. Yet their personal feelings were secondary to their mission. They were choosing duty over survival, group welfare over individual preservation. "Sir," Chen said quietly, "it's been an honor serving with you." "The honor's mine, Amy," Morrison replied. "Now let's make sure we make it count." Quinn followed them as they moved through the tunnels, gathering volunteers for the defense of Section 7. He expected the humans to struggle with recruitment for such an obviously fatal mission. Instead, he watched in amazement as soldier after soldier volunteered immediately upon hearing the plan. Sniper Kelly Brooks was among the first to volunteer. She had been covering the tunnel entrances for 3 days straight, barely sleeping, maintaining her position in partially collapsed buildings that could finish falling at any moment. Her rifle scope was cracked, her ammunition was running low, and she showed clear signs of combat fatigue. "I can hold the north approach," Brooks said without hesitation. "Give me enough ammunition and I can slow them down for at least an hour." "Kelly, you know what this means," Morrison said. "Once those charges blow, anyone still in Section 7 isn't coming out." Brooks nodded. "I understand, sir. But those families with kids need time to reach the deep shelters. If I can give them that time, it's worth it." Quinn studied the female human's face through his sensors, trying to understand the emotions he saw there. Fear was present, certainly. Brooks understood exactly what she was volunteering for. But alongside the fear was something else. Something that seemed to make the fear irrelevant. Medic Sam Foster was the next to volunteer, despite having multiple opportunities to evacuate with the wounded he had been treating. Foster had repeatedly entered active combat zones to retrieve injured soldiers, treating both human and Zephyrian wounded with equal care. His medical supplies were nearly exhausted, and he had been working without rest for longer than Davis. "Someone needs to stay with the wounded who can't be moved," Foster said. "I won't leave them to face this alone." As the volunteers gathered, in Section 7, Quinn found himself experiencing something his species had no words for. His scientific objectivity was breaking down, replaced by something that felt like physical pain in his chest. These humans were choosing to die, not in a moment of passion or desperation, but as a calm, reasoned decision based on principles that transcended personal survival. The attack came 6 hours later. Zephyrian forces poured into the tunnel system, like a flood of metal and energy weapons. The human defenders held their positions with a ferocity that defied their primitive equipment and hopeless tactical situation. Quinn watched Brooks maintain her sniper position even as the building around her collapsed completely. She continued firing until the very moment Morrison detonated the charges, her final shot taking down a Zephyrian officer who had been directing the assault. The explosion that followed shook the entire tunnel complex. When the dust settled, Section 7 was completely sealed along with everyone who had volunteered to defend it. But the explosion had done exactly what the humans intended. The Zephyrian assault was stopped, and the civilian evacuation was completed successfully. Standing in the aftermath, surrounded by the sounds of grief from surviving humans, Quinn realized that his clinical observation had become something else, entirely. He was no longer just studying these creatures. He was beginning to understand them, and that understanding was changing him in ways that terrified his ordered, logical mind. The humans called what he had witnessed courage, sacrifice, and honor. His species had abandoned such concepts long ago as evolutionary dead ends. But watching Morrison weep for the friends he had sent to their deaths, while simultaneously planning the next phase of an impossible defense, Quinn began to suspect that his people had abandoned something vital. These humans were not just fighting for survival. They were fighting for ideas that mattered more than survival. And somehow, impossibly, that was making them stronger than species with far superior technology and firepower. As he prepared his next report to the High Council, Quinn found his hands shaking again. The chemical attack came without warning on the 15th day of Quinn's observation. He watched from his cloaked position as Zephyrian ships released clouds of yellow gas that settled over the human defensive positions like poisonous fog. His sensors immediately identified the compound as a nerve agent designed to cause paralysis and eventual death in carbon-based life forms. Any rational species would surrender immediately when faced with such weapons. Chemical warfare was considered the ultimate tactical advantage, a clean way to end resistance without destroying valuable infrastructure. The Zephyrians had used similar attacks to break dozens of other species, watching their enemies collapse into helpless convulsions before offering terms of surrender. The humans did something different. within minutes of the gas settling over their positions. Quinn saw them emerging from their shelters wearing masks made from torn clothing and improvised filters. They had somehow managed to create protection from materials that should have been completely inadequate. Torn shirts soaked in water, plastic sheeting sealed with tape, even pieces of metal held over their faces as they continued to fight. The improvised protection was not perfect. Quinn watched several humans collapse as the gas found gaps in their makeshift defenses. But instead of demoralizing the survivors, each death seemed to fuel their determination. They dragged their fallen comrades to safety, shared protective equipment, and maintained their defensive positions even as the poison burned their lungs and skin. Maria Lopez was the communications specialist coordinating resistance cells across the planet, and she had been exposed to more radiation than should have been survivable. Quinn's sensors showed cellular damage throughout her body, organs beginning to fail, immune system collapsing under the assault of deadly energy. By any medical standard, she should have been seeking immediate treatment. Instead, she was working harder than ever. "Alpha Base, this is Command," Lopez spoke into her radio, her voice steady despite the blood Quinn could see on her lips. "Zephyrian supply convoy moving through Grid 7. Perfect opportunity for coordinated strike." Quinn listened as Lopez coordinated attacks across multiple locations, her tactical awareness somehow remaining sharp even as radiation poisoning destroyed her body from within. She had refused medical treatment that might save her life because it would require leaving her communication post, potentially breaking contact with scattered human forces. "Maria, you need medical attention now," Morrison had told her earlier. "We can find someone else to handle communications." "No one else knows the codes," Lopez had replied simply. "No one else has contact with all the cells. If I leave this post, we lose coordination across the entire continent." Now, as Quinn watched her plan a complex multi-unit attack while dying, by degrees he struggled to understand the logic behind her choice. She was sacrificing her own survival for abstract tactical advantages that might not even succeed. Yet her sacrifice was enabling coordinated strikes that had destroyed 3 Zephyrian supply depots in the past hour alone. The most disturbing part was how other humans reacted to Lopez's condition. They did not try to force her to seek treatment. Instead, they brought medical supplies to her position, rotating medics through to provide what care they could without interrupting her work. They had accepted her choice, even as it meant watching her die slowly in front of them. This pattern of acceptance and support for seemingly irrational decisions was becoming a central theme in Quinn's observations. The humans seemed to understand each other in ways that transcended normal communication, sharing purposes that allowed them to coordinate sacrifices that served larger goals. Pilot Rick Johnson provided another example that left Quinn questioning everything he thought he knew about survival instincts. Johnson's fighter had been damaged during an attack on a Zephyrian dreadnought, his engines failing, life support systems offline. Standard procedure for any species would be to eject from the failing craft and hope for rescue. Johnson did something else entirely. Quinn watched through his sensors as the human pilot adjusted his flight path, aiming his damaged fighter directly at the Zephyrian ship. The collision that followed destroyed both vessels in a massive explosion that lit up the sky for kilometers in every direction. The tactical result was immediately apparent. The Zephyrian dreadnought had been preparing to bombard a refugee camp, filled with civilian humans. Johnson's sacrifice prevented the attack, saving thousands of lives, including many children too young to fight or flee. But the emotional impact on other humans was what truly puzzled Quinn. Instead of being demoralized by Johnson's death, they seemed to draw strength from it. Radio communications filled with references to doing it for Rick and making his sacrifice count. His death had become fuel for their continued resistance. The refugee camp Johnson died to protect provided Quinn with yet another challenge to his understanding of warfare and civilization. Despite being under constant threat of attack, the humans had established a field hospital in the ruins of their capital city. Medical personnel led by Dr. Emma White were treating wounded from both sides of the conflict. Quinn could not comprehend this behavior. The Zephyrian prisoners being treated in the hospital were enemy combatants who had been trying to kill these same humans hours earlier. By any logical standard, resources spent healing enemies were resources wasted that could have been used to strengthen human defenses. Yet the medical care provided to Zephyrian prisoners was identical to that given to human wounded. Dr. White and her staff worked without discrimination, treating injuries and diseases with equal attention regardless of which species the patient belonged to. The results were not what Quinn expected. The Zephyrian prisoners, confused by treatment that contradicted everything they had been told about human savagery, began questioning their own mission. Several started providing intelligence about their force's weaknesses, tactical plans, and supply routes. "Why do you heal your enemies?" one wounded Zephyrian soldier asked Dr. White during Quinn's observation. "Because you're not my enemy right now," White replied, bandaging the alien's injured limb. "Right now you're just someone who needs medical help." The Zephyrian's response was recorded by Quinn's sensors with perfect clarity. "My commanders told us humans were savage beasts who knew only violence. They said you would torture prisoners and eat the dead." "Do we look like savage beasts to you?" White asked gently. The Zephyrian was quiet for a long moment. "No," he finally said. "You look like people trying to save lives." This conversation, and dozens like it, led to intelligence breakthroughs that allowed human forces to anticipate and counter Zephyrian attacks with unprecedented effectiveness. The medical care provided to enemies was yielding tactical advantages that pure military action had not achieved. But Quinn sensed that tactical advantage was not the primary motivation behind the hospital's policies. The humans seemed to be operating under principles that existed independent of military necessity. They treated enemies with compassion because their moral code demanded it, not because it served strategic purposes. His reports to the High Council were becoming increasingly difficult to write. How could he explain tactical decisions that seemed suicidal yet consistently achieved strategic objectives? How could he describe a species that strengthened itself through sacrifice, that found unity in shared danger, that treated enemies with kindness even while fighting for survival? The Council's responses to his report showed growing frustration with his analysis. They demanded clearer explanations, more logical frameworks, scientific data that could be reduced to predictable patterns. But human behavior was defying every model Quinn tried to apply. "Your observations lack scientific rigor," came one message from the Council. "These humans cannot be acting randomly. There must be underlying patterns that explain their tactical choices. Find those patterns and report them immediately." But there were no patterns, at least none that Quinn's training had prepared him to recognize. The humans seemed to be operating under rules that his species had never encountered, motivated by concepts that advanced civilizations had abandoned as primitive and counterproductive. As he prepared another report filled with observations that made no logical sense, Quinn realized that something fundamental was changing in his own thinking. The clinical detachment that had defined his scientific career was breaking down, replaced by something that felt uncomfortably like personal involvement. He found himself caring about the outcomes of human tactical decisions, feeling genuine concern when human soldiers were wounded, experiencing something that might have been grief when brave humans died for their impossible principles. These emotions were interfering with his ability to maintain objective analysis. But perhaps most disturbing of all, Quinn was beginning to suspect that the human's irrational behavior was not a weakness to be studied and exploited. It was starting to look like a strength that his own species had lost somewhere in their long climb toward technological advancement. The thought that these primitive humans might possess something his advanced civilization lacked was almost too terrible to consider. It challenged everything the Kethrali Empire stood for, everything they had built their superiority upon. Yet the evidence was mounting with each passing day. The end came on the 28th day of siege, though Quinn did not understand at first that he was witnessing an ending. The remaining human defenders had been pushed back to the central plaza of their ruined capital, completely surrounded by Zephyrian forces that outnumbered them 100 to 1. By every tactical calculation Quinn could perform, this was the moment of final defeat. Instead, he found himself observing something that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his existence. Lim. Humans were gathering in a circle in the center of the plaza, their backs to each other, facing outward toward the approaching enemy. Quinn expected panic, desperate last-minute negotiations, or perhaps a final suicidal charge. What he saw instead challenged everything he thought he knew about how intelligent beings faced their own annihilation. Sergeant Mike Turner, wounded, so badly he could barely stand upright, began to sing. The sound that emerged from the human's damaged throat was unlike anything in Quinn's experience. It was not the death wail of a defeated species or the rage cry of cornered animals. It was something else entirely. Something that made Quinn's recording equipment vibrate with harmonics his sensors could not fully analyze. Other human voices joined Turner's song, creating a harmony that seemed to resonate through the ground itself. Men and women, soldiers and civilians, wounded and healthy, all adding their voices to a melody that spoke of loss and hope and defiance all at once. Quinn's translation software struggled with the words, but the meaning came through clearly enough. They were singing about home, about loved ones, about memories worth preserving even in the face of extinction. But underneath those themes was something else. Something that made Quinn's skin change color with emotions he had no names for. They were singing their own funeral song, but they were not mourning. They were celebrating. "What are they doing?" Quinn whispered to himself, his scientific training completely inadequate to process what he was witnessing. Through his sensors, he could see Zephyrian forces surrounding the plaza, weapons charged and ready for the final assault. The enemy commanders seemed as confused as Quinn by the human behavior. They had expected begging, surrender, or desperate attempts at negotiation. The singing was something outside their experience as well. But as the human voices rose together, in their impossible harmony, Quinn began to understand something that terrified him more than any weapon. These humans were not singing because they had given up hope. They were singing because they had found something more important than hope. They knew they were going to die. Every person in that circle understood that the next few minutes would be their last. But instead of being crushed by that knowledge, they were using it as a source of strength. They were choosing how to face their end, and they were choosing to face it together. Captain Morrison's voice rose above the others as he began a verse that Quinn's equipment translated as a promise. They would not break. They would not surrender. They would not betray the principles that had brought them to this moment. Death could take their lives, but it could not take their choice to stand for something greater than themselves. The final battle erupted with an intensity that overwhelmed every sensor Quinn possessed. Zephyrian forces attacked from all directions simultaneously, their weapons creating a storm of energy that should have vaporized the human defenders in seconds. Instead, Quinn witnessed something that would change his understanding of warfare forever. The humans fought with a coordination that transcended their primitive communication systems. They moved as parts of a single organism, each person covering others, sharing ammunition, supporting wounded comrades while continuing to fire at enemies. They had become something greater than the sum of their individual parts. Children too young for combat appeared from hidden positions, carrying ammunition to the adult defenders. Elderly humans too frail to run operated heavy weapons from fixed positions, their experience making up for failing reflexes. Civilians with no military training fought alongside professional soldiers, their determination making them effective despite their lack of formal weapons training. But what truly shattered Quinn's scientific worldview was watching how the humans used their own deaths as tactical weapons. When Marine Kevin Ross saw a gap opening in their defensive line, he deliberately drew Zephyrian fire to himself, absorbing energy blasts that would have killed 3 other defenders. His death sealed the breach and allowed the defense to continue. When engineer Nina Hayes realized that Zephyrian forces were about to break through their eastern flank, she detonated explosives she had been saving for a final emergency. The blast killed her instantly, but took down an entire Zephyrian assault unit. Each death served a purpose. Each sacrifice bought time, created opportunities, or eliminated threats that would have doomed the entire group. The humans were dying strategically, turning their own mortality into a weapon more effective than any technology. Quinn watched civilian teacher Barry Cole use his body to shield a group of wounded soldiers from a Zephyrian grenade blast. Cole, had no military training, no combat experience, no logical reason to sacrifice himself for strangers. Yet he did it without hesitation, his death allowing the wounded to continue fighting. The battle raged for hours, though Quinn's distorted time sense made it feel like both minutes and days. His recording equipment captured every detail of the impossible human defense, the way they adapted to losses, the way they turned disadvantages into tactical opportunities. But the most disturbing element was how the Zephyrian forces began to react to human tactics. These were professional soldiers from a military culture that prized efficiency and logical decision-making. They had conquered dozens of worlds using proven strategies and superior technology. Yet the human defense was breaking their morale. Quinn could see it in their movement patterns, hear it in their communications. The Zephyrians were becoming afraid, not of human weapons or technology, but of human will. They were facing enemies who could not be broken, could not be reasoned with, could not be defeated by normal means. When reinforcements finally arrived, drawn by distress signals Maria Lopez had transmitted before her death, they found something unprecedented in galactic military history. The Zephyrian force, despite overwhelming numerical and technological advantages, had been completely destroyed. The humans had achieved tactical victory through strategic sacrifice, each death building toward an impossible triumph that defied every military theory Quinn had ever studied. But the cost was beyond calculation. Of the 50,000 humans who had defended New Haven, only 17 remained alive. They sat among the bodies of their friends and enemies, wounded, exhausted, but somehow still unbroken. Quinn emerged from his cloaking field without conscious decision, his scientific protocol forgotten in the face of what he had witnessed. Captain Morrison, barely alive and missing an arm, looked up at the alien researcher with eyes that held depths Quinn could not fathom. "We knew you were there," Morrison said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thanks for bearing witness." The simple words hit Quinn like a physical blow. These humans had known about his presence throughout the siege. They had been aware of his observation, had understood that he was recording their struggle, their sacrifices, their impossible victory. Yet they had accepted his presence without complaint or demand for intervention. They had allowed him to document their finest moments and their darkest hours with equal openness. "How did you know?" Quinn asked, his voice shaking with emotions he could not name. Morrison smiled, an expression that somehow combined exhaustion, grief, and something that might have been peace. "We could smell your fear," he said. "Fear smells the same in every species. But toward the end, your fear started to smell different. It started to smell like ours." Quinn looked around at the devastation surrounding the few human survivors. Bodies lay everywhere, human and Zephyrian mixed together in death. The air smelled of smoke, blood, and something else he was only beginning to recognize. It was the scent of courage, and it was coming from himself as much as from the humans. "What you did here," Quinn said slowly, "it should have been impossible." "Most worthwhile things are impossible," Morrison replied. "That's what makes them worth doing." As medical ships arrived to evacuate the survivors, Quinn realized that his mission had fundamentally changed. He was no longer observing human warfare tactics. For the High Council, he was bearing witness to something far more important. He had watched a species discover what it truly meant to be brave, and in the process, he had discovered something about courage that his own people had forgotten centuries ago. The thought of returning to his sterile logical civilization filled him with something that felt uncomfortably like dread. How could he explain what he had learned here? How could he make his people understand that there were things more important than survival, more powerful than technology, more valuable than victory itself? Looking at Morrison and the other survivors, Quinn realized that the real question was not whether he could explain what he had learned. The question was whether he could live with himself if he did not try. The journey back to the Kethrali homeworld took 3 weeks, but Quinn felt like he aged years during the silent passage through hyperspace. He spent most of the time listening to recordings of the human voices singing in their final moments, trying to understand the emotion that had transformed their fear into something resembling joy. His species had no equivalent for what he had witnessed. The Ketherali had evolved beyond physical conflict millennia ago, resolving disputes through negotiation, logic, and careful resource management. They considered themselves the most advanced civilization in the galaxy, having achieved perfect peace through the elimination of irrational emotions like courage, sacrifice, and honor. But sitting alone in his ship, surrounded by recordings of humans choosing death over surrender, Quinn began to question whether his people had evolved at all. Perhaps they had simply forgotten how to be brave. The High Council chamber was exactly as he had left it, all crystal surfaces and soft lighting designed to promote calm, rational thought. But after weeks in the chaos of human warfare, the sterile perfection felt suffocating. Council leader Thane gestured for Quinn to begin his presentation, his expression showing the same detached curiosity that Quinn himself had once brought to his research. "Your reports have been most unusual," Thane said, his voice carrying subtle disapproval. "The data you transmitted was often incomplete, sometimes contradictory, and frequently failed to follow proper scientific protocols." Quinn nodded, knowing that his observations had become increasingly personal as his time with the humans progressed. "The humans are difficult to categorize using our standard frameworks," he said. "Their behavior patterns do not follow predictable models." "All behavior follows patterns," Thane replied firmly. "You simply need to look deeper. Show us what you discovered about their military capabilities." Quinn activated the presentation system, filling the chamber with images from the siege of New Haven. He watched the council members lean forward with interest as they saw human defensive positions, weapon systems, and tactical formations. This was the kind of data they expected, concrete information that could be analyzed and filed away. But as the presentation continued, showing humans making seemingly irrational sacrifices for abstract principles, the council's expressions changed, from interest to confusion to something approaching disgust. "This behavior serves no evolutionary purpose," observed Council Member Krath, her voice tight with disapproval. "These humans are throwing away their lives for gains that cannot justify the costs." "Perhaps," Quinn said carefully. "But their seemingly irrational tactics achieved complete victory against superior forces." "At what cost?" Thane demanded. 50,000 casualties to achieve what proper negotiation could have accomplished without any deaths at all. Quinn felt something twist in his chest as he listened to his colleagues dismiss human sacrifice with casual calculation. "The humans were not given an opportunity to negotiate," he said. "The Zephyrians came to conquer, not to bargain. All conflicts can be resolved through proper application of logic and resource distribution," Krath stated with absolute certainty. "These humans simply lack the intelligence to find peaceful solutions." The words hung in the air like poison. Quinn looked around the chamber at his fellow scientists, seeing them through eyes that had watched humans die for principles his people no longer understood. These Ketherali were intelligent, cultured, and completely safe in their perfect civilization. They were also utterly incapable of understanding what he had witnessed on New Haven. "The humans have something we do not," Quinn said quietly. The chamber fell silent. Thane's expression shifted from disapproval to something approaching shock. "Explain that statement," he commanded. Quinn took a breath, knowing that his next words would change everything between him and his people. "They have courage, not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite overwhelming terror. Everything I observed stems from this single characteristic. Courage is an evolutionary dead," and Thane said flatly, "species that prioritize individual sacrifice over group survival are eliminated by natural selection. We abandoned such primitive concepts because they serve no logical purpose." "Then explain how the humans achieved total victory against impossible odds," Quinn challenged, his voice growing stronger. "Explain how 50,000 beings armed with primitive weapons destroyed a force that should have conquered them in hours." The council exchanged glances, their discomfort obvious. These were beings who prided themselves on having logical explanations for everything. But human behavior was challenging their fundamental assumptions about how intelligence should function. The Zephyrians must have made tactical errors, Krath suggested. Superior technology always prevails when properly applied. I have complete recordings of the entire siege, Quinn replied. The Zephyrians followed optimal tactical protocols throughout the engagement. Their defeat was caused entirely by human actions that defied logical prediction. He showed them Morrison's final stand, Turner's death song, the volunteers who chose certain death to buy time for civilian evacuation. With each example, the council members grew more uncomfortable, their worldview challenged by evidence they could not dismiss. This is aberrant behavior, Thane declared finally. These humans are clearly suffering from some form of mass psychological dysfunction. No rational species would make such choices. What if rationality is not enough? Quinn asked. What if survival requires something beyond logic? The question silenced the chamber completely. For a civilization built on the supremacy of rational thought, the suggestion that logic might be insufficient was almost blasphemous. Your objectivity has been compromised by prolonged exposure to primitive behavior, Thane said coldly. You will submit to psychological evaluation and reconditioning. But Quinn was no longer listening. He was thinking about Maria Lopez dying of radiation poisoning while coordinating resistance across a continent. About Rick Johnson flying his damaged fighter into an enemy ship to save strangers. About Captain Morrison weeping for friends he had sent to their deaths while planning the next impossible defense. His people would never understand what he had seen. They would classify it as dysfunction, treat it as a disease to be cured, file it away as another example of primitive irrationality. They would learn nothing from human courage because they no longer had the capacity to recognize courage when they saw it. No, Quinn said quietly. The word fell into the chamber like a stone into still water, creating ripples of shock that spread through the assembled council members. What did you say? Thane asked, his voice dangerous. I said no, Quinn repeated, standing up straighter. I will not submit to reconditioning. I will not pretend that what I witnessed was dysfunction, and I will not let you dismiss human courage as evolutionary failure. He thought about Turner singing his death song, about the 17 survivors sitting among the bodies of their friends, about Morrison thanking him for bearing witness. They had chosen to face the impossible because someone needed to stand against the darkness. Now it was his turn to choose. You are relieved of your position, Thane declared. Security will escort you to psychological facilities immediately. But Quinn was already moving toward the chamber's exit, his mind clear for the first time since returning home. He had work to do, and very little time to do it. The stolen research vessel was small but fast, equipped with the most advanced communication systems in the Ketherali fleet. Quinn had liberated it from the orbital shipyards 3 hours after his confrontation with the Council, along with complete databases of Zephyrian invasion plans and tactical assessments. Now, as he transmitted warnings and defense strategies to a dozen different species marked for conquest, Quinn finally understood what Captain Morrison had meant about bearing witness. He had watched humans discover what it truly meant to be brave, and that discovery had changed him in ways that could never be reversed. He could no longer live safely in his sterile civilization, while other species faced the darkness alone. His hands shook as he sent the transmissions, not from fear, but from something the humans had taught him to recognize. It was the terrible, beautiful weight of choice, the moment when someone decides that some things are worth dying for. The communication console chimed with incoming messages from the species he had warned. Questions, requests for more information, expressions of gratitude from beings who now had a chance to prepare for what was coming. Quinn smiled, an expression he had learned from watching humans face impossible odds with unbreakable determination. His own people would hunt him now, brand him as a traitor, try to stop him from spreading what they would call contamination. But they would be too late. The knowledge was already spreading, carried by his stolen databases and transmitted warnings. Other species would learn what humans had discovered in their moment of greatest trial. They would learn that some things were worth fighting for, worth dying for, worth standing against impossible odds to preserve. The final entry in Quinn's research log was brief but complete. They told me to study humans in war. I thought I would document their defeat. Instead, I learned that some species carry within them a flame that cannot be extinguished, not by superior technology, not by impossible odds, not even by death itself. The humans call it courage.